You know how some people are really good at math, while others are really good at languages, and some learn 1 second language and others learn 5, 10 or even 15 languages. How can these polyglots learn so many languages, even if it seems like a really hard language? What even is a hard language and how long does it take? Well, in this video I will try to answer these questions while speaking some other language as well, because why not? Because I believe there really is no hard language, and I think you can learn and anyone can learn any language they want if they do it the right way. Tijdens mijn werk kom ik vaak mensen tegen die niet uit Nederland komen. En ze zeggen heel vaak, Nederlands is best moeilijk. Vooral de woordvolgorde, de grammatica, en het is een moeilijke taal. Ook de uitspraak is lastig. En ik geef ze er wel gelijk in, maar aan de andere kant, wat mij opvalt is waar ze vandaan komen. Bijvoorbeeld, ik kom heel vaak mensen tegen uit China, Polen, soms Spanje. En als je kijkt naar het verschil tussen Nederlands en die talen, dat is best wel groot. Bijvoorbeeld iemand uit Duitsland en iemand uit Nederland, die taal lijkt heel erg op elkaar. Maar als je kijkt naar iemand uit Polen of uit China, die taal lijkt totaal niet op Nederlands. Chinees en Nederlands zijn echt, nou ja, ze lijken enigszins op elkaar in woordvolgorde, maar de grammatica en wat dan ook is echt helemaal anders. Ich glaube, dass Sprachenlernen nicht nur schwierig ist, aber es ist einfach anders. Ich spreche jetzt Deutsch und man sagt immer, dass Deutsch schwierig ist, weil es die Fälle gibt. Und wenn deine Muttersprache Niederländisch ist, dann weiß man, dass wir das in Niederland gar nicht kennen. Wir haben davon eigentlich nie gehört. Aber ich habe in der Schule nicht nur Niederländisch und Deutsch gelernt, ich habe auch Grammatik gelernt. I'll come back to that later, why that is so important. Zum Beispiel, wenn du weißt, was das direkte Objekt ist, Direct Object, dann weißt du auch, welche Fälle du brauchen sollst. Übrigens habe ich 5 Jahre Deutsch gelernt in der Schule, aber ich spreche es gar nicht heutzutage. So, is German a hard language to learn? Well, I don't think so. Yes and no, it depends on your native language, of course. I think when people say hard, what they mean is it is very different and they're not used to it. But you'll get used to it over time, so it gets easier over time. But does it mean that it was hard in the first place? Well, I don't think so. So the point that I was trying to make in German is that you don't know the language that you speak. You just speak it, and the reason that you speak it is because you grow up in an environment in your native, in your country where they speak the language, and your brain was picking up the patterns and was just hearing all this language, but you never really learned it until maybe you got in high school. At least for me, that's when I started really learning Dutch and grammar. But by then you already speak the language, so yeah. So this process that you go through as a child, can we take that and apply to other languages? Well, technically no, because you can only be a child once. But now that we are older, we have a brain and we can use it to learn about this process and then apply it to other languages. And this is why polyglots are so good at learning languages. This in itself is a skill, and if you don't believe me, it's the reason that when you hear something in your native language that is incorrect, you just know that it's incorrect. You don't necessarily know why, but you hear that something isn't right. I remember in high school my English teacher used to say, I need you to tell me what is wrong with this sentence, and you can't just say, well, it just sounds better this way or that way. You have to actually explain to me why. But that goes against how your brain works, because your brain spent all these years learning the language and picking up things without learning the rules. So it doesn't know why something isn't or is correct, but it knows, well, I mean, it does know when it is correct, but it doesn't know what is wrong. And it recognizes when you make a mistake, but it doesn't know exactly what the rules are. An example in English would be red big dog, which sounds a little unnatural because a more natural sentence would be a big red dog. And that is because in general in English you put the adjective, so the word that describes the noun, which is the dog in this case, you put the adjectives in alphabetical order. So B comes before R, big red. And that is why big red dog sounds better. But you've probably never heard of this rule, so how are you supposed to know? Well, by just encountering it and observing it, and you don't learn about it, your brain just picks it up. 英語ができる方として日本語を勉強を始めた時、同じこと、違うことも両方ありますね。例えば、漁師、リンゴを食べたいって言えば、英語だと I want to eat an apple ですね。でも、日本語だったら、という助詞を使って、英語で全然使う必要がない。全然そんなこと全然ない。でも両方分にはそれはリンゴが direct object ですね。And if you know this concept of direct object, and let's say you want to learn Chinese, and Chinese does something weird with direct objects, then at least you know how to find the direct object and what it is. And that gives you some kind of advantage. But I understand if you don't want to become a language nerd and you don't want to learn about language and what is the direct object, what is an indirect object when you learn another language, which is totally fine. I mean, that is also not what your brain was doing when you were a child and you learned your native language. I'm just saying that as you're learning a language and as you're learning more, you sometimes start noticing these things like, oh, these parts of sentences go like this and this is how this works. And you pick up on these things. So if you learn another language, it'll be easier and faster, and you already have some experience with languages in general, if that makes sense. But you don't have to learn about all these things. It just makes your journey to fluency a little easier, if fluency is what you want. But what is fluency actually? Hablar con fluidez es para mí hablar sin pensar en tu nativo idioma. Si quieres decir algo, lo haces en tu idioma nativo o tu target language. Mientras estudias, estás desarrollado un segundo cerebro para no tener que traducir en tu idioma nativo. Pero es este fluidez. Output es importante porque te obliga a pensar sin mucho tiempo. Tal vez te gusta más inputs como mí, como yo, y intentas entender todo en tu target language. Y si puedes hacerlo, ¿tienes fluidez? For me, personal, I think if you can do both, that is pretty fluent. So, how long does it take? Well, the time it takes to become fluent in language takes two things. One is time, and the other is obviously the language that you're learning. So there's this list made by the FSI, which is the Foreign Service Institute in America, I believe, and they made a list where they categorized languages based on the difficulty. And so there's five categories. One is easy language and 5 is obviously super hard language. And if you take the languages from before, we can actually see that Japanese, for example, is a super hard language. It's category 5. We can see that German would actually take the average English person 900 hours to study, which is far less than 2200 hours for Japanese. But what if you're not a native English speaker? Well, let's take Japanese, for example. But for Japanese speakers, actually the other way around. For them, it is super hard to learn English. But for example, Korean is not as hard for them because those languages are kind of similar. Whereas for English speakers, learning either Korean or Japanese is super hard because they are both very different from English. So you see what I'm saying? It's all about the perspective. So my advice is just have the right mindset. For example, when I started learning Japanese, I didn't even know there was such a list that displays all the languages by difficulties. And I didn't know Japanese was super hard. I just heard the language and I was interested, so I started learning. And for German, it's the same thing. Although I did learn it in school, in Schule. I did learn it in Schule, but I've learned it for 5 years, which is probably more than whatever 900 hours. But you know, I am far from fluent, and it's easier understanding for me, but it's hard to speak for some reason. But I guess that's normal. It's been a long time since I've spoken German, so I'm not fluent at all. So if you're learning by yourself, then don't focus on these numbers, especially since, for example, 2200 hours is a lot of hours, so it might seem very unmotivating. And if you want to stay motivated, it's best to just learn 30 minutes a day, because 30 is not as much and you can do it. And you will find that if you learn for 30 minutes a day and you do it every day, that it'll get easier, and it is just about consistency, in my opinion. That's also what I did. I learned for about 30 minutes each day, and I just moved on to the next day. I did another lesson, and every day I would do one lesson for maybe 30 minutes, maybe a bit longer or shorter, whatever. And if you just learn every day for, let's say, 30 minutes, you'll get there in no time.